this policy of mass deportations is often what,
Mhm.
or one of the things that leads people to describe Trump as an isolationist, and also to point to his anti-war rhetoric. He's often described as the anti-war candidate. Do you think
Mhm.
that's an
Mhm.
accurate summation of Trump? Do you think he's an isolationist? Do you think he's anti-war?
Well, he's definitely not a warmonger. I mean, he's not a peacenik, but he is absolutely not a warmonger. He has been scathingly critical in the past of America's forever wars. So say of the old Republican Party's wars in the Middle East. He says, the Americans, wasted well over $1 trillion on those wars, and really, what did we get? Very arguably, the situation is worse than it was before America intervened. I mean, this is not a view limited to Trump, by the way, as you know. I mean, Phil Gordon, who is Kamala Harris's national security advisor, wrote a few years ago a very good book called Losing the Long Game, which is a history of America's interventions in the Middle East, and almost all uniformly catastrophic or, unproductive, disastrous, pick your adjective. So he does not believe that America should be imposing its values on the rest of the world. Um, and he certainly has nothing but scorn for the idea of nation building. So he's really quite at the polar opposite of neocons, in the Bush-Cheney era.
Mm.
Um, in terms of, is he an isolationist? Yeah, I think he's on the spectrum of isolationism, globalism. He's definitely more on the nativism, isolationist end of that spectrum. His slogan is America first, America first. That's what it's all about. So yes, I think he's very skeptical of alliances. I mean, according to John Bolton, who was his national security advisor, he wanted to pull out of NATO, and he rattled allies and close friends, um, particularly the Europeans, but also the Japanese and the South Koreans. And of course, he admires and wants to be friends with dictators. So he's very fond of Vladimir Putin and professes to be great friends with Kim Jong-un. Is a professed great admirer of Xi Jinping. So they're the, it's mind blowing, isn't it? Really, it's kind of the reverse of what you expect from the America we've kind of grown up with.
Absolutely. And Malcolm, that probably leads me to ask you about an essay that you've written for Australian Foreign Affairs, which it turns out is a
Mm.
very prescient one. And much of the
Mm.
essay is devoted to how Australia should deal with Trump. And you wrote that two big mistakes were made in 2016 when he was first elected. The first being that the assumption that Trump would be institutionalized by being in the White House, that he'd be kind of moderated by being in government. And the second was that the only way to deal with him is to suck up to him, to ingratiate yourself with him.
Mm.
And you argue in this essay that that second mistake is one that will be repeated. Do you think that's happening already?
Well, it's probably a bit early to say. I mean, there've been lots of very, flattering, saccharine-laden congratulations, but I mean, that's kind of to be expected. But look, a lot of people, a lot of leaders, are just yearning for a pat on the head from the American president, and their KPI is, being warmly received in Washington. And you know, you've got to you've got to recognize. I mean, if you're a leader, as I make the point in that essay, you've got to recognize if you're a leader that Trump is a bully. He's highly transactional. The only thing he respects is strength. If you stand up to him, you may incur his displeasure, but you will win his respect. And you can lavish him with flattery and suckiness, and get nothing. And then a good example is Boris Johnson, who was all over him like a cheap suit. And after the Brexit referendum, was promising that, that Britain would get this fabulous trade deal with the United States. What did it get? Nothing. So, I mean, because Trump's not going to act against what he sees as his own self-interest. He is not an altruist. Okay. Now, from Australia's point of view, and you and I have talked about this before, but one of the problems we have is that because, in large part, because of the AUKUS deal arrangements, we are actually much more dependent on the United States than we were before. We always have been pretty dependent on them from a strategic point of view, but we're now much more dependent on them, right at the point when they are becoming less dependable, in the sense of much more keenly focused on what is solely and wholly their interest. We have less leverage than we had before. Let's put it that way. So it's a difficult time. So I think the AUKUS Pillar 1 will be seen as being a huge mistake. As a deal, the only real clear beneficiary would be the British shipbuilding industry. I don't actually think it's in the Americans' interest in net terms, but you could argue it is, that they get, a big submarine base in Western Australia and they get money into their shipbuilding industry, and they don't have any real obligation to sell us any submarines. I mean, can you imagine how much respect you get from Trump for doing a dumb deal? I mean, so we have done a deal. This is the deal. This is the genius deal that our government has done. We've agreed to send billions of dollars to the Americans to help them, improve their shipbuilding industry. They've agreed to sell us several Virginia-class submarines in the 2030s, second-hand ones and potentially a new one. But they've done so with the express proviso in the deal and in the legislation that no submarine can be sold to Australia unless the President certifies its transfer out of the US Navy would not diminish the underwater capabilities of the US Navy. In other words, that they can spare it. In other words, it's surplus to their requirements, putting it another way. They're already 17 Virginia-class submarines short of what they believe they need. They already cannot maintain their submarines at a sufficient rate at the rate they need to keep the ones they've got left, the ones they have, in service at the appropriate levels. In other words, they should have about 20% of their fleet, in dock undergoing maintenance or out of service undergoing maintenance. It's over 33%. So, that's a problem. And in terms of the actual production, they should be producing at least 2 a year. They're producing between 1.2 and 1.3. And to have any hope of providing Australia with submarines, they've got to up that to over 2.33. Now, maybe all of that can be done. Maybe it all can be done. But we'll have very little influence on it. And unless it is, there is literally zero prospect of an American president certifying. So, which is why in Washington, what is being widely canvassed and openly is the outcome where Australia gets no submarines at all. And you see, when I was dealing with Trump over the refugee deal and saying, you've got to stick with the deal I did with Obama, I could say to him, look, I have a deal, with your government, albeit with your predecessor. When the Americans turn around and say, we can't spare the subs, you're not getting any subs, we can't say you've double-crossed us or you've done the wrong thing, because if anyone was stupid enough to say that in Australia, I don't think we could. They'd just say, look, read it. It's up there, in capitals.